Hello everyone, this is the slideshow video for the types of argument. Uh, and basically these types of arguments are different types of data that you might use to back up your argument. If you remember last class we talked about the Toolman model and how an argument consists of a claim, uh, the data to back it up, and the warrant that connects the claim to the data. So these are different types of data, and we'll talk a little bit about those, and also how you can end up rebuttaling or refuting different kinds of data. So again, so far we've learned the components of an argument, the claim and data or ground. Um, Hopefully you've learned to construct solid claims. Again, remember, these are brief sentences. They're straightforward and to the point, and they're declarative. Hopefully you understand the import of warrants for your argument strength. That is what the argument presumes or assumes can help you indicate how strong the argument is. And you can always offer a counterclaim as another way to rebuttal arguments, right? So you can challenge their warrants. You can offer a counterclaim, right? They say racism is institutional. We say no, racism is individual, not institutional. They say police killings are disproportionate. We say no, those killings were justified. But also, besides that, you can also rebut by challenging their data directly. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we counter the data or the claims? And the key here, three key principles: credibility, relevance, and sufficiency. Credibility, the question of is this author qualified and believable? Relevance, is the data actually measuring what they claim it's measuring? And sufficiency, is there enough data to back up these points? So we'll go through different kinds of data now. And the first kind of data is called an argument by example. With arguments by example, it's sort of like what it sounds. We use an example as your data, as proof of the more general claim. So, for instance, here, the criminal justice system is biased. Joshua Reynolds received a longer sentence than most white sexual offenders. So I'm using the example of Joshua Reynolds to back up my claim that the criminal justice system is biased. Obviously, some questions you can ask about arguments by example, that is, ways to rebut these arguments by example. Again, sufficiency, relevance, and credibility. So are there a sufficient number of examples? Obviously one example from Joshua Reynolds is probably not enough to prove the broader claim there. Are the examples relevant? Is Joshua Reynolds' race really relevant? Maybe his crime was particularly brutal or something like that. And then are the examples typical? Sometimes there's a fallacy called a hasty generalization that says you took kind of the most extreme or most radical example and used it to make your point. This doesn't happen very often. It's sort of the claim, the counterclaim here, right? This isn't a typical example. It doesn't happen very often. You can also offer counter examples, which also challenges sufficiency, right? If there's not only one example and you can prove a counter example, then maybe we don't have sufficient examples. Second type of data is argument by analogy, where you make an analogy to a different case in order to draw a claim. So here we go. Prison labor is like slavery. Prisoners work without being paid. That's an example of an argument by analogy. We're making an analogy between prison labor and slavery. Again, ways you can rebut an argument by analogy. Are these compared cases really alike? So this is a question of relevance. In this case, for instance, prisoners have committed a crime and slaves didn't commit a crime. So maybe the cases aren't really alike. Are the cases accurately described? Again, a question of relevance or sufficiency. Maybe prisoners are paid a little bit of money, right? Maybe the work that prisoners do helps them reduce their sentence or something like that. And then are there other factors which may not make the analogy translate to the new case? Again, potentially a question of relevance or of sufficiency. One other factor here, again, being the prisoners have committed a crime and are being punished, and slaves did not. The next type of data is argument from causal correlation. So this is just an argument that's data says these two things are correlated, so therefore one probably caused the other. We have arguments from correlation all the time, right? Like we'll say something like this person smoked and then they got cancer. Obviously, smoking caused their cancer. Or here's an example related to our topics. Prisons reduce crime. That's my claim. Crime rates declined at the same time that imprisonment increased. So I'm saying there's a correlation. Imprisonment was going up and crime rates were going down. And therefore, I'm making the claim that prisons caused the reduction in crime because this correlation points to those things. Some questions. There are ways you can rebut causal correlation. First, is this sufficient? Is the association between cause and effect consistent? Maybe in other countries or in certain states, there was an increase in imprisonment and not a reduction in crime. So does it happen most of the time or all of the time? Also, is it reversible? That is, if we reduced prisons, would crime go up? If we reduce prisons and crime didn't go up, then maybe there's not sufficient evidence to prove that point. Are there other possible causes or similarities in the cases? For instance, maybe the economy was rising at the same time, and that's why crime went down. Or maybe education levels were going up, and that's why crime went down. Also, another question of sufficiency, is the association a strong one? That is, does it always happen? Is that always the case, that these things happen? Or is it possible that the correlation is backwards, right? In our case, that doesn't really make sense. But sometimes people will say, for instance, Facebook causes narcissism, and it could be actually the opposite, that just narcissists are attracted to Facebook. And again, a sufficiency question, does the movement from cause to effect follow a regular and predictable time sequence? That is, shortly after we increased prisons, did crime go down? And did it do it in every state? And did it do it regularly? If not, then maybe you don't have sufficient evidence. There's also arguments from causal generalization, which is sort of the reverse of causal correlation. This is where we argue from the general to prove a specific cause. So our data is a generalization about causes, right? So here's an example here. I'm making the claim the death penalty causes more violent crime. And my data for that is a causal generalization. Violence generally begets violence, right? And so, this might seem a little strange, but we use these kinds of causal generalizations quite frequently, right? We might say something like poverty causes crime. That's a causal generalization, right? Obviously not, it's a generalization because not all poor people commit crime. So some ways you can rebut or question this kind of data. Is the cause sufficient? That is, in this case, is there enough evidence that violence always begets violence? Might the cause result in different effects? For instance, there's some instances where violence might reduce violence. For instance, World War II. Going to war in World War II ended the Holocaust. Might intervening factors stop the expected cause-effect chain, right? Are there other reasons why violence might or might not beget violence? Another relevance question might be, does this apply in this actual case? Does the generalization apply in this specific case? If you go back and look, the death penalty causes more violent crime. Violence begets violence. Is the death penalty really violence? It's certainly not the same way as murder or rape is violence. So maybe there's a relevance question there. Another type of data is sign, arguments from sign, right? It's sort of like it sounds like when we use something and claim that it's a sign that something more general is true, right? So I might say the rise of Black Lives Matter is a sign that there's an unjust criminal justice system. We might say the spread of white vigilantes is a sign that police are not respected by the general public. So again, critical questions to ask or ways to rebut these arguments from sign. Are the cited signs always indicators of the general theory? In other words, is this sign really relevant? In our case, for instance, the Black Lives Matter example, maybe people perceive that the criminal justice system is unjust, but that might not be relevant to whether it actually is or not, because people don't perceive the entire criminal justice system. Are there enough signs present? Is just one sign sufficient to prove the case, or do you need more signs? Also, are there contradictory signs present? Maybe, police abuse and violence has been going down, so maybe that's a contradictory sign. Or maybe support for Black Lives Matter has been going up, so maybe that's a contradictory sign. The next type of data is argument by definition. This is where you use the definition to prove a case. So for instance, I'm sorry for the typo here, but example, policing is not racist, only some cops are. Racism is bias by individuals. So I'm defining racism to deny the resolution's point that policing is racist, right? I'm trying to kind of make the argument here that only some cops are racist, and racism is about individuals, so therefore you can't claim all policing is racist when only some individuals are racist. Obviously, to rebut this, I could offer a counter definition, say, no, racism is about institutional practices. It's not about individual beliefs. So we could ask some questions or rebut this. Is this definition accurate? Where did you get, is this how most people define racism? Most experts define racism? So are there counter definitions? Obviously, there are counter definitions that say racism isn't really about individuals, but it's about institutional practices. So questions of credibility, where did this definition come from? Who's making it? Does the definition support a particular interest? Is it funded by a particular interest? And does the definition exclude or ignore other important cases? For instance, in our case, in our debates, racial profiling as a police tactic isn't included in the definition, right? It's not something that individuals do. It's a policing tactic, and so therefore would not be called racist. But obviously, racial profiling has some racist elements. So this definition is, maybe we could argue, too narrow and therefore not sufficient to capture the extent of racism. Only a couple more here. The next one is argument from authority. This is basically where your data says, authorities say, or experts say, or studies say. For instance, the war on drugs is a failure. Studies show that drug use has not declined, right? Or we might say, America has an over-incarceration problem. Experts agree that there's no need to imprison people, that there are too many people imprisoned for nonviolent crimes. Some hailing experts, some hailing studies, and a lot of times, those can be strong arguments, but just because an expert said it doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. Here, credibility is key, and we will talk next week about arguments, about credibility, and what makes a credible source. Also, sufficiency is an issue here. Is this generally accepted by experts, or is this just one sort of rogue expert or something like that? You can find one doctor who says that it's demon sperm or whatever that causes the coronavirus, but generally the experts and the consensus of experts are that that's not the case, and that maybe that doesn't even exist. So, are there sufficient number of experts backing this up? And also, are those experts credible? The final one and the closely related is argument from statistic. This is where your data is a statistic or a number. So, for instance, police disproportionately shoot people of color. Maybe I would have a specific statistic here, like 73% of police shootings are against people of color. Or I might say the shooting percentage does not match the percentage of the population. So, African Americans are 15% of the population, but they constitute 40% of the police shootings. A lot of times we hear numbers, I think, and people shut down and think I can't rebut that number, and maybe look for an alternative number. But a couple of things to think about when people are gathering statistics is, first of all, sufficiency. How large is the sample size? Oftentimes you'll see they only studied 30 people, or they only studied one state or something like that, right? And that might not be enough to prove more general claims about people in general or America as a whole. So always ask yourself, how large is the sample size? And that can be something that you could even ask in cross-examination and kind of make the other team look unprepared. How many people were studied in this study? How large was the sample size? Also, does the study measure things accurately? That is what it's measuring relevant and also well put together, right? There's a thing in studies where they tend to do placebo controls, and they also tend to do what's called double-blind studies. They also tend to do they don't want to have leading questions and things like that, because there's a way to do studies to get whatever answer you want if you ask leading questions, for instance. Relevance, like I mentioned that claim earlier about how some studies say that only measure police shootings by the ones that were found as unjustified and not justified. Right? So anytime the court or the police department says, "Oh, that shooting was justified," then some studies don't take those into consideration. But you might challenge that study's relevance by saying, "Look, the whole criminal justice system and the police department and the courts are biased towards police and against African Americans. So only studying unjustified killings isn't very relevant to the question here of whether the criminal justice system itself is biased." So again, just because there's a number doesn't mean that you can't question that number. Ask, how did they measure that number? How do you even study such a thing? And how large was their sample size? Another sufficiency question might be also the question of, has this been backed up by other data and by other studies before? So that's it for today. Hopefully that gives you some ways to rebut arguments even when maybe you don't have a direct counter to the other side's argument. And also to understand your own arguments and the types of data you're using. It's good in these debates to mix up data. If you have an example and some statistics and some authorities and some causal correlations, then you're going to have a much stronger argument than if you present only one kind of data. We'll talk about that next week as we talk about building our debate cases a little bit more. But try to mix your types of data up. And as you're doing the rebuttals, try to question the credibility, the relevance, and the sufficiency of the data that the other side has offered. Have a great week, and thank you very much.